Hello, so I'm going to read you the second part of this book. If you remember, Mr. Greg was just going into the house after seeing some ducks flying close by to the house. So we'll find out what happens next. When morning came, Mr. Greg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put out a hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where is my hand?" He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe he had hurt it in some way. He tried the other hand, but that wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Greg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Greg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too, for he was now a tiny man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller, and where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck wings instead. But, cried Mrs. Greg, going purple in the face. "My dear man, what's happened to you?" "What's happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Greg. It was Mrs. Greg's turn to jump out of bed now. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Greg, and she too had got wings instead of arms. Oh, sobbed Mrs. Greg. "This is witch's work," cried Mr. Greg, and both of them started running out of the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. "Mama, Mama, Mama," chirruped Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly," and they flew up into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Greg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had now flown right out of the window. Mr. and Mrs. Greg ran to the window and looked out. The two tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Greg said to Mr. Greg, "Do you think we could do that, my dear?" "I don't see why not," Mr. Greg said. "Come on, let's try." Mr. Greg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once he went up. Then Mrs. Greg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going up. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Greg. "Don't be afraid." So out of the window they flew, far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family were flying around and around together. "Oh, isn't this lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, are they, my dear?" Mr. Greg said to Mrs. Greg. Mrs. Greg, "Not at all," Mrs. Greg said. "I could do this forever." "Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody's walking into our garden." They all looked down, and there below them, in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous wild ducks. The ducks were as big as men, and what's more, they had great long arms like men, instead of wings. The ducks were walking in a line into the door of the Greg's house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Greg. Flying down low over their heads. "Go away, that's my house." The ducks looked up and quacked. The first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him. The door shut. The Gregs flew down and sat on the wall next to the door. Mrs. Greg began to cry. Oh dear," she sobbed. "They've taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go." Even the boys began to cry a bit now. "We'll be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip. "I want to sleep in my own bed," said William. "Now then," said Mr. Greg, "it isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we're going to do?" "What?" they said. Mr. Greg looked at them and smiled. "We're going to build a nest." "A nest?" they said. "Can we do that?" "We must do it," said Mr. Greg. "We've got to have somewhere to sleep. Follow me." They flew off to a tall tree, and right at the top of it, Mr. Greg chose the place for the nest. "Now we want sticks," he said. "Lots and lots of sticks. Off you go, all of you, and find them and bring them back here." "But we've got no hands," said Philip. "Use your mouths." Mrs. Greg and the children flew off. Soon they were back carrying sticks in their mouths. Mrs. Greg took the sticks and started to build the nest. More, he said. I want more and more sticks. Keep going. The nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was very good at making the sticks stick together. After a while he said, "That's enough sticks. Now I want leaves and feathers and things like that to make it nice and soft inside." The building of the nest went on and on. It took a long time, but at last it was finished. "Try it," said Mr. Gregg, hopping back. He was very pleased with his work. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried Mrs. Gregg, going in and sitting down. "I feel I might lay an egg any moment." The others all got in beside her. "How warm it is," said William. "And what fun to be living up so high," said Philip. "We may be small, but nobody can hurt us up here." Okay, so we'll leave them there in the nest and you can hear the last part next time. Okay.